in my lifetime, I'll just throw it out there, Frank, I'm 47 years old. And in my lifetime, we've lost more lives to guns than in all of the casualties of all of America's wars combined.
Mm-hmm.
And it became the number one cause of death during COVID 2 years ago, the number one cause of death of kids in America, more than cancer or car accidents. And that's why we say you can't be pro-life and ignore gun violence. You know, I think that when people say it's a heart issue, I think they're right. There is a heart condition that we need God to heal, but this is also a policy issue and something that, as Martin Luther King again said, a law cannot make you love me, but it can make it harder for you to kill me. And that's what we need to be about, is making it harder for folks to kill. And right now we're making it really easy. Is that your art on the wall, Frank?
Yes, you're in my studio.
I'm in your studio. Sweet. I should show you some of Katie's art. Have you seen our little, we don't have much of it here, but this is our hearts we make out of melted down bullet.
Oh yeah, I like that. Keep that handy. We'll use it in a minute. Okay. We're doing.
Okay, we're going live.
Hey, this is Frank Schaeffer. You are watching and or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Today, I'm speaking with an old friend that I have a lot of love for and admiration, someone I've known of and about and in person for a long time now. And that is Shane Claiborne, who, let's see, is a peace activist. I'm going to introduce him right, but I've got to read the thing Ernie put up here. Is a peace activist, a speaker, and the author of, most recently, Rethinking Life, Embracing the Sacredness of Every Person. And Shane is someone who does all sorts of things. Red letter Christians, we're friends of all kinds of people, but you know, there's an issue that I've been talking with my producer, Ernie Gregg, about just before we got going here, saying, I'm really going to drill down on this one today with you, Shane. And this is the topic I want to address. Let me set this up by just saying Shane is not just a sort of a generic peace activist, whatever the hell that means, but one of the things he's done and has handy right here is a little piece of a gun. Pick up that thing again. That you were showing me. Now, who made that?
Katie and I made this. So,
right.
And just to be very clear, fact checking on that, Frank, this is this is actually bullet casings that were melted down. I'll show you I'll show you the gun thing in a minute, but we get these bullet casings, you know, sadly.
Sure, no, I know.
You know, they're on our street. So we have a little bucket that people can put them in and we melt them down, and that's what they look like. So
yeah, and you also turn guns into something besides guns.
Yeah, so this is our inspired by the prophets Micah and Isaiah beating swords into plows. This is our beating guns into plows. So this is one of the tools that we made. Every part of that is this is the barrel of the gun that's turned into a tool for the garden, and we're turning the handles too out of the wood stock. So it's pretty. Sometimes, Frank, I tell my evangelical friends, this is what a gun looks like when it gets born again. So there you go.
That. Well, you know, which is a good segue into something. Here's what I want to get into. But before that, I want you to tell me about your background with this issue. You know, we talk about school shootings. We talk about the fact that guns are now the leading cause of death for children in the United States for the first time in history in the last 2 years. Before that, it was accidents, road deaths, and so forth. We talk about, you know, the proliferation of weapons in our streets and crime and all the rest of this. One thing that's been jumping out at me recently that obviously we all know about, but just a sort of a quirky little thing, is all these insane accidental on purpose shootings. You know, a black kid rings the wrong doorbell. He's gunned down through the door. A white girl walking a dog crosses somebody's lawn and is shot from the porch. A guy sees a kid ripping off his car from where he's parked it on the sidewalk. He uses his Apple phone device to track it, goes to the parking lot of a mall a couple miles away, finds the kid sitting in the car, shoots him point blank in the temple through the glass of the car, of the door. You know, in addition to all the other gun deaths we talk about, there's a kind of a madness afoot in the land, which is I guess, the extension of open carry without a permit. Everybody has a gun, no questions asked. Supreme Court striking down any law that prohibits guns, say in New York, whatever. So that's the context of the discussion I want to have with you, a sort of a wide-ranging look at what I would call the mass hysteria, paranoia, gun-carrying culture we now live in, on top of everything else. And to get into that, I want you to tell me, take a couple minutes here, and I will not interrupt you, to tell me about your background with this issue, because you're one of the people who has actually tried to do something about it. And I just think it's absolutely remarkable that you got there first on all this. I forget how long it's been, but every time I've seen you speak publicly, or I've been with you personally and privately at Red Letter Christian meetings, whatever it may be, there's Shane and he's doing something about guns in the street. Unpack that for us. What's your history? When did you become aware of this issue so far ahead of the rest of us? And what have you been doing about it day in, day out for years? Bring us up to speed, and then let's dive into the madness that surrounds us.
Yeah, well, we'll get into it. I mean, first of all, I grew up with guns. My wife grew up with guns. I'm from Tennessee. She's from North Carolina. So we, in fact, we talk about that in our book, Beating Guns, about, growing up very familiar with guns. And yet, I think where we sit determines what we see. And so when I moved into North Philadelphia 25 years ago, Frank, a quarter of a century ago, that's where, I really began to see the loss of life of folks. And like you said, I mean, one of them was like a 3-year-old on their front porch, the block over here. Another was an elderly person. One was a 19-year-old that was killed in front of my house. And so that when this hits close to home, I think it makes all the difference in the world. And that's what happened. We just saw too many lives lost on our streets. And Dr. Martin Luther King, who is an inspiration on many levels, but when it comes to gun violence and violence, one of the things that he said is that we're all called to be the Good Samaritan and lift our neighbor out of the ditch. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say, maybe we need to do something about the road to Jericho. You just got to figure out why people keep landing in the ditch. And this is where I think you rightfully point out that this is a distinctly American crisis. There are folks that say, oh, it's not a gun problem, it's a heart problem. The fact is that every country in the world has people who have heart problems, are sinful people, people that are racist or that are wanting to do violence, folks that struggle with their mental health, whatever it is. Like that, people have violent video games in every country in the world, violent music, violent movies. And yet what's unique about America is the access that we have to weapons that can do so much destruction. And that's why I really started researching and leaning into this and writing a book on it. And the new book, Rethinking Life, kind of digs a little deeper on some of this. But I mean, just to frame it a little bit, even as we were writing these books, we had to change our statistics because the gun violence was increasing at a level every year. So when we started writing Beating Guns, it was 90 a day. That was our stat. And before we published the book, we had to go back and change that statistic to 100 a day, and then 110 a day. Now it's 120 lives a day. So as you said, during the pandemic, we hit gun deaths like we haven't seen in ever. We hit the most gun deaths that we've ever had in the history of the city of Philadelphia, and that's been true around the country. Over 40,000 lives lost a year to guns. And so in my lifetime, I'll just throw it out there, Frank, I'm 47 years old, and in my lifetime, we've lost more lives to guns than in all of the casualties of all of America's wars combined. Mm-hmm. And it became the number one cause of death during COVID 2 years ago, the number one cause of death of kids in America, more than cancer or car accidents. And that's why we say you can't be pro-life and ignore gun violence. So, I think that when people say it's a heart issue, I think they're right. There is a heart condition that we need God to heal, but this is also a policy issue, and something that, as Martin Luther King again said, a law cannot make you love me, but it can make it harder for you to kill me. And that's what we need to be about, is making it harder for folks to kill. And right now we're making it really easy.
Yeah, it just seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you've done so much more work on this than me, and I tend to declaim with an air of certainty, having written myself about how certainty is a killer and we should all embrace paradox. I'm still the son of a preacher, so I declaim things as if I'm certain about them, but I'm not. So correct me as we go along here, and I will not take any offense. But it seems to me that just as the statistics have gone up during your lifetime and during the years that you've been working on this issue, similarly, the situation, the political and legal situation has been changing radically from when you wrote the book. We have 6 conservative Supreme Court justices now that are rubber stamping anything virtually the NRA gets behind, including striking down laws in crime-prone areas like New York City that have tried to control, for instance, the carrying of handguns. That's a new phenomenon. We all know there was an assault weapons ban decades ago that was then struck down, but now we have a Supreme Court for the first time in American history that is ideologically driven and might as well have every single thing they rule on written for them by the NRA. But bookended with that, so they're the sort of elite, bookended with that at the bottom, if you want to put, of the American culture, you have these militia movements, open carry now being used. I mean, I'm 70, okay? Until recently, I had never seen a photograph of someone carrying a loaded assault weapon on the steps of a government building like a state house. And that's even before the Capitol was stormed, et cetera, et cetera. So talk for a little while to us about how the culture around guns, the gun culture, the gun cult, if you like, has also become more radicalized in a kind of a mirror image, cart and horse situation with the statistics, which are still skyrocketing. It isn't just that these numbers are out of control. The people who could do something about it, starting with the Supreme Court, aren't. And of course, the Republican Party has become the party of open carry, where you've got legislators wearing AR pins on their lapel. My old Republican friends like Jack Kemp, who was a congressman, or Bob Dole, who I knew well, they wore American flags.
Yeah.
They didn't wear gun pins. So, I don't even know where to start with all this.
Yeah.
Take us there.
So there's a couple of things worth unpacking, I think, in what you said. And one of them is that I want to distinguish between the gun extremists and gun owners, or, we might say the gun profiteers and the gun owners. Like, here's what's interesting, especially as I dove into this full on and wrote about it and researched it, is that the NRA, the National Rifle Association, says that they have 5 million members. And let's just say that they do. What that would mean is that 90% of gun owners are not affiliated with the NRA. And in fact, recent statistics show that a majority of gun owners find themselves at odds with the NRA, with the extremists, with this idea that if they take assault rifles, they're going to come for our hunting guns. And so, Moms Demand Action now has more members than 5 million, more members than the NRA. But that little group of what I would call gun extremists are holding the conversation hostage.
And how are they doing that? Just drill down on that.
They own many of the politicians, but they're very active. And this is one of the places that, in our book, we kind of say, if there's one thing that you do want to affirm from the NRA, it's how active they are. And when you ask them, have you ever contacted a senator or a legislator, like, it's overwhelming. And I've got the exact numbers in the book. When you even ask them, have you done it in the last year? overwhelmingly, they say, yes, we're in regular contact with our representatives. When you look at that poll more generally of folks not in the NRA, it drops almost in half. So they're more active, they're more vocal, they're more financially contributing, and all this stuff. So I think that small group, that's why it has a disproportionate amount of influence. And so here's the good news in all of that, Frank, is that a majority of gun owners find themselves at odds with the NRA, and they want to see changes. Upwards to 80% of gun owners, and it's even higher, 90% or more of Americans in general, want to see changes. And what does that look like? People sometimes say, like, what do you mean by common sense changes? And this is one of real life change that we're going for in Pennsylvania, is called one handgun a month. It would limit the number of handguns, these are handguns, pistols, that one person could own in a year to 12. And you go, like, this is not a violation of the Second Amendment. In fact, it's actually putting in the well-regulated part of that to say, who needs more than 12 handguns in a year? I'll tell you who. Someone that's not making the world safer, and someone that's likely making a lot of money off of selling handguns. And so those limits, those are the ones that start to make sense to people. We know that a disproportionate amount of gun violence happens at the hands of folks that are even 16 years old to 20 years old. So raising the age limit, like, if you can't rent a car and you can't buy a beer, like, why should you own an AR-15? So these are like good questions. Things like background checks, things like domestic abusers having access to weapons. We know that that's one indicator that if you're hurting people in your own family, you're likely to either kill them or also to hurt someone outside your family. So, like, if you've been convicted of domestic abuse, you shouldn't be able to own a firearm. Red flag laws, all that. So these are all, like, I think there's a bunch of these. One of them is a limit to the capacity guns can shoot, right? So when the Second Amendment was written, guns shot 1 round, maybe 2 rounds a minute. Now they can shoot 100 rounds a minute. So guns that are designed for one purpose, to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, like the AR-15, the AK-47. Those are weapons of war that are still allowed on our streets. And this is not hypotheticals. We had a AK-47 shooting 1 block from our house, 40 rounds in less than a minute. 2 people were killed. So this is reality. And the dissonance, I think everybody's starting to see, thank God. Like, for instance, it's illegal to own fireworks in Philadelphia, and yet you can have an assault rifle, right? Fireworks are unsafe. And why is that? Because the city of Philadelphia unanimously banned assault rifles. We don't have grenades on our streets. We don't want AR-15s on our streets. The police, no one wants those on our streets, right? Except the NRA and the extremists. And so they will take municipalities to court. And as you said, take it all the way to the Supreme Court to say, Philadelphia, if they ban assault rifles, they're violating the Constitution. So I think it's why we've got to have all of this happening at a local level in municipalities and states, and we've also got to be challenging at the Supreme Court level. And let's keep taking the NRA, the Supreme Court, and maybe we can really bankrupt them. Yeah.
One thing that I want to talk to you about. Let me just reintroduce you. This is my friend Shane Claiborne, whose most recent book is Rethinking Life, Embracing the Sadness of Everyday Sacredness, sadness, mental slip there, of everyday person. You've also got that other book that you've written that you just referenced a moment ago, and I don't want to mangle that title the way I just mangled this one.
No, it's all good. Yeah, the title's Beating Guns, but we were very deliberate about the subtitle on that one too, Frank. And it's a book for people who are weary of gun violence.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of us that are. Yeah,
and so having reintroduced you a little bit, just saying this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and if you like this conversation, please share it and get the word out, please, and also like it in the online sense and on all the various places we appear, like Substack, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to change gears here a little bit, because aside from the fact that you have become a national expert on this area, and we're going to get back to the gun violence itself here, battle with the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, and disagree, please, if I'm not phrasing this correctly. But you are also someone who comes from an evangelical Christian background. You put your money where your mouth is with intentional living and helping people. You're the kind, and I am not being condescending here, forgive me if this comes off wrong, but to people watching my program here and who listen to me, a lot of them follow me, having written about my departure from the evangelical world. And I have a lot of people who are followers on Facebook, et cetera, who listen to my podcast because they too have struggled with their own spiritual journey out of conservative Christianity. And like me, some of them have gone further than that. And, you know, I wrote a book called Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. And the title's a little bit paradoxical, but the word atheist is in there for a reason. That being the context, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but it seems to me that the NRA and the extremists in the NRA are the problem. One of the reasons that they are a problem is that they have hook, line, and sinker reeled in the influence of the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. The Republican Party only is in power anywhere because of the white evangelical vote. I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that if you took the evangelical vote out of the equation, Donald Trump never would have been president. He never would have appointed any of the justices that, for instance, Franklin Graham, who gave him a list and said, this is who we want, or Ralph Reed or the other evangelical white activists have given him. I don't think you can discuss this issue of gun violence without asking what happened to evangelical Christianity. Let me preface this so you know where I'm coming from, and it's not trying to make a hit on white evangelical Christians. You know, I left the evangelical movement. People say, well, why did you leave? They're surprised when I tell them that the beginning of my journey out is when I compared the lack of love, authenticity, and compassion that I was raised with in my parents' small mission of L'Abri before my dad became famous and became a big-time evangelical leader. You know, it was basically meeting people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and flying around in Jerry Falwell's private jet and meeting all these high-powered evangelical Christians, Dr. Dobson and others. That's where I began my journey out, because it was like, well, if this is what it's coming to, I don't want any part of this. I remembered my parents doing more what you did, and that is an open home, an intentional community, caring for people. It was nothing to do with the NRA and the Republican Party. It was to do with trying to share the love of Jesus, literally, with others. And for all my disagreements with the evangelical community, just to get really personal, when I got my girlfriend Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18, it was the L'Abri community that gave us the basis of a continuing happy marriage. 53 years later, we're still together. That wouldn't have happened without the love and care of that intentional evangelical community. And so what I want to say is it isn't with a sense of I told you so or triumphalism when I say it is the white evangelical vote that keeps this whole ball rolling. If you really want to dig down, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I want your opinion on this as someone who must also be heartbroken in terms of the direction this has taken. Because even if evangelical Christianity is nonsense and none of it ever was true and there was no Jesus or he didn't raise from the dead, whatever you want to do, this isn't the faith I was raised in.
Well, I've also navigated some of these same contradictions, and it's actually part of why I continue to write. You know, I mean, this newest book, Rethinking Life, is about how abortion became the issue that eclipsed all other issues. I mean, it's about a lot of other things too. It's about how we become so narrow and how we think about what it means to champion life. And yet, I think what's clear to me, Frank, is that some of the loudest voices aren't always the most beautiful voices. And the reputation of Christianity has really been hijacked or distorted by some of the folks with the biggest megaphone that don't represent, I think, some of the really beautiful expressions of Christianity. I mean, just a part of that too is how even white evangelicalism has dominated the landscape of what it looks like to be Christian, even though Christians of color that are in charismatic, they might not use the word evangelical because of how it's been distorted, but they want to invite people into a personal relationship with Jesus. They love scripture. I mean, many of the distinctives that are core distinctives of evangelicalism are true in other kind of streams of faith outside of white evangelicalism. And that's why I think I want to be careful not to allow the most toxic parts of Christianity to kind of colonize the landscape. And I've found spiritual vitality outside of white evangelicalism. I've found that in the Liberation Church of Oscar Romero and Paulo, Freire. I've found it in the historic Black Church in America, in multi-ethnic evangelical congregations that are thinking outside the box because they're led by leaders of color and not just kind of entrenched in white evangelicalism. Groups like CCDA and all, there's just so many beautiful things happening in the church. And there's always some bones to spit out, so it does grieve me that one of the biggest obstacles to Christ are Christians. And yet I think that Jesus also used some of his harshest words for religious people. He rebuked the religious people of his time who used their religion to camouflage their bigotry. He called them a brood of vipers. He said, woe to you. You travel all across the land to make a single convert, and then you make them twice the sons of hell that you are. I mean, those are pretty big words. That's not me, that's Jesus, So I think that contradiction has been there for a while. As Jesus said, the wheat and the weeds are all growing together. And in this book, Rethinking Life, I try to track some of that in these moments in history, like the Nazi Germany or the colonization of native lands, you had two kind of competing narratives of Christianity. And one was for life, champions of life. The other was deadly, toxic, twisted theology that cost people their lives. And those are kind of competing with each other around, enslavement. And even to this day, I mean, I think Trump kind of surfaced some of those competing narratives of Christianity. And that, that's why at Red Letter Christians, we kind of say, we're going to keep coming back to Jesus. As Gandhi said, when they asked him about Christianity, he said, I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians acted more like him. And that's what we're after. And we're very, fully cognizant that there are versions of Christianity, or, I might put quotes on that. There's versions of faith that are trying to camouflage themselves as Christian, but they really don't look very Christ-like at all. So if it's not about love, let's not call it Christianity. If it's not welcoming immigrants, then it's not Christianity. If it's not good news to the poor, then it's not the religion of Jesus.
I interviewed, I'm just reaching over here to get his book. I interviewed recently another friend of mine, Jeff Charlotte, who writes a new book called The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. And before that, he wrote the book called The Family, which you're aware of. And then there was a Netflix series made out of it. Jeff has written a really interesting book because he has a lot in there about going to these armed camps and homes and readouts and militia groups across the country. He's a very courageous guy, crisscrossing, writing these pieces for Vanity Fair. And then in the book, just talks about, through this series of essays, the fact that in his view, there is a genuine fascist movement abroad in the United States. It's a lot of these folks are armed, paranoid, misinformed. They're also conspiracy theorists and buffs. It seems to me that a lot of these guys get kind of, taking your side on this for a minute, get swept into the white evangelical label, but actually, a lot of these folks never were white evangelicals in any sense. They're not church-going people who somehow slip towards fascism. They are out and out armed anti-government activists. They are very dangerous people. It's a horrible movement. It's the kind of movement out of which came the folks who wanted to kidnap a governor and maybe torture and kill her. You know, this is not sort of evangelicalism gone wrong. I just want to pick your brains here for a minute on how these two kind of rivers have flown together and get confused. You know, there's a real fascist movement in this country that's gone, you know, they've gone a step further than Trump went. There is this evangelical conservative vote, and a lot of those guys are armed, including pastors and so forth. How do you look at the next 10, 15 years of American history? Jeff says we're on our way to real full-blown 1930 to 33 style German fascism. He doesn't say they're going to take over and win, but he says, let's not pretend these folks aren't there. He thinks that they're very dangerous. And then on the other hand, you have the kind of evangelical voter who, a lot of them, when polled by people like the Washington Post and New York Times, seem to share conspiracy theories with QAnon and other people. So evangelicalism, not the whole picture, which you very rightly clarified, but this element of it seems to also become more and more unhinged as time goes by. And I just wonder, you know, you're in touch with so many people. You know, I'm talking to Shane Claiborne, he knows some stuff, and I want to dig down and get you to tell us what that stuff is. How do you see this?
Yeah, so I would start by saying this, that every religion seems to get distorted and abused and exploited to cover up hatred. There are forms of Judaism that are used for really violent ideology. I mean, you just go into the Abrahamic Mosque in Hebron, you can see the bullet holes in the wall from a Jewish extremist. We obviously know the ways that Islam can be distorted and used for violence and hatred. And yet what happened around the country, and I was in Iraq and Afghanistan as a peacemaker during some of this, there was an entire global movement of Muslims against Muslim extremism that were calling this out and saying it's not actually Muslim at all. It goes against the core teachings of our faith. So let's not even call it Muslim, you know, and there's groups now like Christians Against Christian Nationalism, where Amanda Tyler and others, you're probably a part of that, I certainly am, where they've said Jesus is used as the mascot. You know, is actually just used and abused, literally taking the Lord's name in vain because they want nothing to do with actual teachings of Jesus, but they want to camouflage their hatred. And that's what happened January 6th, right? We saw the Jesus signs and the Confederate flag and the Trump signs, and people killed folks and did tremendous violence. And then the guy with the horns, you know, prayed in the name of Jesus, right? Like, so that's really messed up. But it's not new. I think that's also important, is that the KKK for you know, decades and has had on their website an entire apologetic of why they are Christian. And obviously not many of us are going to, you know, buy into that, but there are some people that are. And I think that's what is that there's this group of folks that are using the Christian faith to hide their own hatred and their own violence, to camouflage their bigotry. And so we really need to correct that. And I think that's where they are a minority voice, though. And I think this is where, you know, some of the statistics can help us, just to like go back to the guns, because I think they are a good indicator of some other problems, right? Yeah. So with guns, 2/3 of Americans live unarmed. 2/3 live without guns. Now, what was really disturbing is that Christians own guns at a higher rate than the general population. So it's almost half of Christians that own guns, evangelical Christians in particular. But here's what's interesting, is that there's a little group, like 3% of Americans, that own almost half of the guns. That's the extremists, right? 3% that are owning like 20 guns average each. I mean, we do a profile of one guy that's got 4,000 guns stockpiled. So there's this idea that on the one hand, they want to be patriots, but on the other hand, they're ready to kill the National Guard. They're ready to kill federal agents or folks that are trying to protect the Capitol. So there's, I think that that's where the average person who loves Jesus is going, there's nothing Christ-like about this, but we need moral courage right now, right? And we need it from folks that are not just speaking in silos. And this is where I would have a little critique, Frank, of folks on the left, is that we're not going to move the barometer by surrounding ourselves with people that agree with us on everything. And I'll just give an example of that. One of the ways that we see ourselves moving things on gun violence is with coalitions like Hunters Against Assault Weapons, gun owners concerned about gun violence. So these are folks that, like my family, that might have a 12 gauge to keep a coyote from eating a baby cow, but they're not believing in that we should have AR-15s on the streets. One of the T-shirts that they had on a march here in Philly said it was Hunters Against Assault Rifles, and on the back it said, you don't need 10 rounds to shoot a deer. So those are groups that are going to move things, on the death penalty. A lot of these are like issues of life that are not partisan. I mean, we haven't had a president that was vocally and publicly and even on their platform against the death penalty until now. And I think Joe Biden, he flipped on it. He was for the death penalty, and I think could do a whole lot more on this. But in many states, it is conservatives concerned about the death penalty, like in Oklahoma, that are opening the door to the abolition of the death penalty. So we got to think outside of just the partisan camps on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, one good example of thinking outside the partisan camp is I was surprised about 10 years ago when the Koch brothers actually got into some prison reform stuff. Who knew? I mean, probably the only thing I ever agreed with them on, but you find your allies, my dad always used to talk about the difference between allies and co-belligerents, and that a sensible person always would look for a co-belligerent, whether they're an ally or not. So good point. Let me go back to something else. And again, forgive me if I return to this too many times, but on the evangelical front that owns more guns than the average American does, which is an unfortunate thing. And I say evangelical, you said Christian. And of course, I don't know how we define that, conservative, Roman Catholic, whatever that, but the point being, it seems to me that part of the one way to look at Christianity and its teaching is as an apocalyptic cult, in the sense that it's always, as you know, you and me, you've been alive long enough to have cycled through all these books by Hal Lindsey and all the rest of it, Frank Peretti, all these other evangelical best-selling authors. Compared to my book sales, I get the crumbs from the table compared to these guys. If you want to write a bestseller, write an apocalyptic book about the pilot being snatched from the cockpit and the plane crashing as he's taken off to heaven. But all joking aside, it just seems to me that, just as you say, every religious group produces extremism, true enough, doesn't color the whole texture. But Christianity has a kind of an angle on apocalypticism. And it's not a coincidence for the last 50 years that every single one of the best-selling books by any kind of Christian has been, in that apocalyptic vein. They've outsold all the rest of them put together. What can be done about this other than better theology or no theology at all, and embrace my view of atheism, whatever. But it seems that this built-in flaw or teaching or wrong teaching, however you want to interpret it, is one reason why you have all these people expecting Armageddon all the time. They are very paranoid people. They think someone is coming for them. They're coming for our guns, or the federal government is coming for our rights, or they're going to, there's going to be, trans people coming to take our children, or gay teachers are going to, there's always something, but it always has that kind of apocalyptic paranoid ring to it. I don't think you can just say, well, there's some extremists and the rest of them are okay. I think that's everybody within the evangelical community. They embrace an apocalyptic vision of everything. It's all going to end in blood and flames and chaos, and then Jesus will return. I don't think there's a tradition within Christianity that doesn't have some form of this. And I think that it is the root of a lot of the problems that come out of the tradition. I don't know how you see that, but that's my view.
Well, it's interesting. So I definitely would might push back on that just a little bit, Frank, very respectfully.
Please do.
I think that, so first of all, I think, you know, as our friend Jim Wallace often says, the answer to bad theology is not no theology, but it's good theology. And I think that's true of bad religion too. I have a whole section of this new book on bad religion, also kind of giving a nod to the punk rock band Bad Religion. But anyway, you know, that the answer to bad religion is not no religion, but good religion. And I mean, you know, I think Jesus is pointing that out, like religion, he's always challenging the folks that were religious, but were not moved in love and compassion, like in the Good Samaritan story and the Lazarus and the rich man story, all these stories, right? So, I think that there are groups that are doing really good theology, even around the end times. I mean, I think that part of what's happened from James Cone and the historic Black church is that there has been this sense of a liberating good theology that even can interpret Revelation in ways that are true and that are life-giving. And that don't end with this kind of crazy, whacked out, violent, apocalyptic Armageddon scene, right? In CCDA, the Christian Community Development Association, that's where some of my theology was shaped. And one of the whole mantras that I heard, you know, for years and years was the whole thing begins in the Garden of Eden, but it ends in the city. In the Revelation story of the New Jerusalem, it's a city brought back to life, right? Where the river of life runs through it, unpolluted, I would say, you know, like without lead in it. The tree of life flourishes. It says that there's no sanctuary there because God dwells with the people. So it's not that we go back to the Garden of Eden, but we see a restored creation, a renewed city. It also says that the gates of the city are left open, so people can live without fear. So it makes all the difference in the world how we think this story ends. Also, like whether we just think that this whole thing is about escaping this world or renewing and transforming it, you know. So I think there's really good theology that's out there. It's not necessarily had the biggest megaphone, but I think it's there, and we've got to keep amplifying it. It's what we're doing at Red Letter Christians. You know, we say we're going to change the narrative by changing the narrators. So we need that good theology out there. You know, even now I'm getting ready to read a book on Revelation. I'm not scared of it, you know, but I do think of it a little bit like the Matrix film, you know, like it's, you know, this is not, anyway, you know, but I think that there's parts of scripture that we've really distorted. But that's also why at Red Letter Christians we talk about centering Jesus. You know, Jesus, as I have come to know Jesus, is what scripture says, the full revelation of God. This is God in the flesh, the word made flesh. We don't just have words on paper. And so anytime someone tries to distort scripture to justify their own racism or violence, it always has to be bounced off Jesus. And it's very hard to stay centered on Jesus and justify violence and hatred. And so we keep coming back to Jesus. And I think a lot of people that have left versions of Christianity, they haven't left Jesus. They've actually left those versions of Christianity because they have left Jesus. They've lost their grounding and centering on the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, Matthew 25, when you do it to the least of these, you do it unto me. So, you know, I want to, as the great presiding bishop Michael Curry says, I want to reclaim Jesus. You know, I don't want to, I don't care about reclaiming the word evangelical, but I'm not willing to concede Christianity to folks that have really distorted it. I want to keep reclaiming it. And you go to a bad concert, you don't give up music, but I sure want to sing a better song when it comes to Christianity than the music that some people have heard.
Yeah, I love that. Let me talk about something that's related to something we were speaking about earlier, in terms of this idea of these armed camps in the country that are kind of an undertow of threat out there on let's call it the sort of crazy conspiracy theorist right wing. Let's not push that off on evangelicals, because it's certainly not Christian in any form as defined by you just now. But it seems to me that one mistake a lot of Americans make, because we're so provincial in so many ways, is that a lot of this discussion, both from the right and the left, ignores something, that this worldwide phenomena of using religion as the backstop for hate and authoritarianism and outright totalitarianism now in the case of Vladimir Putin. He is talking about upholding Christian values. He's talking about, white supremacy in a way. He's talking about Christian nationalism. This is why Tucker Carlson spouts him. This is why a lot of the guys at Fox News are kind of in his corner. The same thing is happening in Hungary with an authoritarian regime. Just to make sure that, we throw the net wide enough, it's what's going on with Modi in his Hindu nationalism in India. It's the same thing. The big chunks of the West Bank being occupied by Orthodox Jews who are the equivalent of right-wing American Christians, often, by the way, supported by people like John Hagee and evangelical right-wing Christian Zionist groups. I just like your thoughts of this disturbing worldwide phenomena of the rise of authoritarian, anti-democratic leaders, who, at best authoritarian, at worst real totalitarians, not kind of like Hitler, but in the case of Vladimir Putin, the next Hitler. How does that all fit together with whatever we can do in terms of Christian witness in America, of calling the bedrock true evangelical Christ-following voter to open their eyes and understand that we are in a genuinely apocalyptic battle for keeps here between anything that might be described as freedom and democracy and this resurgence, part of which is very armed in our country, to get back to your stuff about guns and the NRA. There's a really big picture here that we see unfolding at this moment of history that I won't live to see the end of, because I'm 70 years old. You may be around for more of a conclusion to this. I doubt it. But how is it that in the age of reason, enlightenment, post-World War II, we're back in exactly the same place again, with a land war being of aggression in Europe being fought by a man who uses the language of Christianity and the defense of Christian values against gay people, trans people, who he actually folds into his speeches, picked up by American right-wing media. My head's exploding.
Well, so, that's big, Frank. That's big. I guess where I would begin on this is that, there's certainly forms of fascism and in a lot of different places in the world as different expressions, but I think when we're looking kind of close at home here, it feels like we really are at a historic crossroads, and a lot of that has to do with the changing demographics of our country, right? Where the white folks that have held power for so long, this is shifting a little bit. And so I think, people have named it in different ways. There's a white fragility, there's a white fear, there's a white rage, there's a white lash from the, in sense of backlash from the Black Lives Matter movement, the first African-American president, all that stuff. There's this kind of rise in white supremacy that was certainly unleashed in new ways during Donald Trump, but it was there, and this has happened historically over and over. Wherever people of color have gained some progress, there's this backlash that's happened. So I think we have to name that, that a lot of this has everything to do with power and folks that are using and abusing and exploiting Christian faith in order to retain or to gain power. And this is also where Jesus shines so brightly. I mean, it's as if we never heard him say, what good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? And so we see people that aren't even gaining the whole world. They're just gaining a few seats on the Supreme Court and they're losing their soul. But other folks, I think in Russia and other places that are trying to gain the whole world and they're losing their soul. So I think
and the case of Russia, supported by
yes,
Archbishop
absolutely.
Kirill of Moscow, who is acting not like, but exactly imitating the head of the Lutheran Church that bowed the knee to Hitler at one point and said, "Hey, you're our guy." I mean,
yeah. So I think, that this is where like Dr. King is such a powerful voice when he says that the church is not meant to be the master of the state. And the church is not meant to be the servant of the state. The church is meant to be the conscience. It's meant to be this prophetic moral conscience in the country. And so to me, this is about choosing fear or love. And there's a beautiful place in scripture, right? Where it says that perfect love casts out fear. And I think like fear and love are opposing magnets. You can't hold them together. And much of this is about fear. It's about power, but it's also about a fear of losing power, of other people replacing us. All of this language that we see, right? And so I think we've got to really name that and say that we're going to choose love and we're going to rebuke this fear-driven ideology. In our several of our books, I talk about the Cato study that it kind of shows how our fears are being shaped and formed. And often to fear as white folks, people who look different from us. And this particular study talked about refugees and immigrants at the time where we were hearing a lot of fear mongering, a lot of desecrating and dehumanizing of folks that are trying to flee terrible situations. And but this study shows a list of things that are more likely to kill you than an immigrant or refugee. And they're things like roller coasters and lightning, a cow, right? Falling down the steps is more likely to kill you than an immigrant or a refugee. I believe police, law enforcement are on that list, but like you look at this, one of them was a vending machine falling on you is more likely to kill you than an immigrant or refugee, but we're conditioned to fear. And that's why I would say, like Christians of all folks, like we should be the folks that are going, no, we're going to choose love. I mean, even if someone kills us, we believe in resurrection. We're going to rise from there. Like we've got nothing to fear. And we've got to choose love. And that's what you don't hear much about, Frank. And I think this is important, is that there's sort of a litmus test of love in all of this. You hear a lot of people talking politics, talking, these militia groups, these Christian nationalists, but you don't hear much about love. You sometimes hear Jesus kind of distorted and used as a mascot, but you don't hear love. And if it doesn't sound like love, then it's not Christian. There's Jesus said, you'll know that they'll know that you are Christians by your love. And so we've got to say, does it sound like love? Does it smell like love? Does it? And as our friend Barbara Brown Taylor says, right, brother, she said, the clear line I draw these days is if my religion gets in the way of loving my neighbor, I'm going to choose my neighbor because God never told me to love my religion, to love my theology. So in the end, this really is about love, and that is who God is.
Let me jump in here.
God, but love, God is love.
I love what you're saying, and it's a wonderful place to almost wrap this up, but I have one more question that I do want to wrap up on. I have been talking with my friend Shane Claiborne, who is the author of Rethinking Life, Embracing the Sacredness of Every Person. And do you happen to have that book handy?
Yeah, sure do.
Would you please hold it up so we can, I should be holding it up here. Pretend that's me. It's not an author pitching himself. I'm asking him to do this. I want you to make sure you follow Shane's work and get this. By the way, we will link to everything that you tell Ernie, our producer, to link to, so people don't have to scratch around to trying to find your books or what you do or Red Letter Christians. Just give Ernie a list. Everywhere this is, we will be linking to Shane. Please support him and get in touch with him, read his book. That said, where I'd like to finish up here, because you do, a lot of folks, you're very well regarded within the evangelical community, or should we say the better parts of it. How do you read the temperature and be realistic and truthful here in the younger cohort coming up. I'm thinking of the millions of kids who have been homeschooled, who are at places like Liberty University, going through the Falwell machine or what's left of it, or Wheaton College or Gordon, or none of the above, more secular institutions, Christian high schools. What is the temperature and flavor of whatever the newer generation is coming? Are they going to be more in Shane Claiborne's corner? Are these going to be cookie cutter Franklin Grahams out there helping Donald Trump become president for the 30th time or whatever it is? I'm being facetious, but Shane, how do you wrap this up by giving us a flavor of what's happening out there with your ear to the ground, with younger kids, young people coming through? What do you see there?
Oh, well, this is a good place to end, because I have a deep hope in my soul, and it's not unsubstantiated. I think, I'm coming off the energy of just yesterday, being in Nashville, Tennessee, where we had thousands of us marching in the streets, praying, filling the halls of the Capitol in Tennessee. And part of that was sparked by the Tennessee Three, right? Justin Jones, who's been a dear friend and organizer for years and years. We've done a bunch of stuff with him at Red Letter Christians, and Justin Pearson, Representative Gloria. So those two young Black legislators that were expelled from the Tennessee legislature and reinstated, of course. But I mean, it's no coincidence that they're young. But they're also, what's more important than they're young, I think, is that they are fueled by their faith. They are deeply rooted in their love for Jesus and their connection to the movement of Jesus in the world. And I mean, you see them praying, you see them calling out scripture all the time. And so when it comes to, combating bad theology with good theology, they're doing it. And we were there to join them and so many other Tennesseans. At one point, they asked clergy and faith leaders to stand, and there were hundreds. And many of them are young, right? So there is this changing narrative, I think, that's happening. And on a lot of these things, you can get a little indication for that, like on the death penalty. It's like 80% of millennial Christians, so Christians born after 1980, 80% are against the death penalty. And it's not in spite of their faith, but because of it. They've read the Sermon on the Mount. They've seen Jesus interrupting the execution and saying, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." So I'm really encouraged by that. And I think we can stand behind it. We can support it. And we can be led by it. We weren't there to stand in front of the Justins. We were there to stand with them and behind them, and just to say, this is beautiful. So I think there is a changing narrative, and the young people are fed up. They're finished with the excuses, with the thoughts and prayers without action accompanying it. I mean, there were just hundreds in the streets yesterday. We see it from the environmental movement to the Black Lives Matter movement to the March for Our Lives, to the young people coming out of Parkland and other places. These are young people that are done with the excuses. Now, I will say that, like, one of the vulnerabilities is that they see the potential that some of our institutions, our social institutions, could have. And so a lot of them have a contentious relationship with the church, with denominational institutional Christianity. They love Jesus, but they're suspicious of Christians for justified reasons. But it doesn't end there. There's a great article in the Atlantic that says, how will this generation change Washington when they hate it so much? Mm-hmm. So the discontentment with politicians and the lack of changes on sensible things, right? On bipartisan things like immigration reform, like things like that. So there is this kind of holy discontentment. So I think that's why we need, sort of, as Reverend Barber calls, a third reconstruction. We need a total rethinking of things. We need a spiritual renewal and revival, because this is not just a political crisis, but it's a spiritual one. So we need a touch of the Holy Spirit. So I'm sorry to give an altar call on your show, Frank, at the last minute, but no, I'm just kidding. I really do think that there is something new surfacing. I felt it yesterday in the streets of Nashville. I kind of see it every day on the landscape of Christianity, and I hope that we're we're sensitive to what the Spirit could do, even, as we say, to bring new life out of the compost of Christendom.
Well, let us wrap it up there, because we did not write this or rehearse it. It's almost too perfect of an ending. But once again, this has been In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and it's everywhere podcasts can be found. Shane, send this out to people, because I'm sure you do a lot of interviews, but none with someone that likes you more than I do. I know that's a weird thing to say, but I'm so totally in your corner, it brings tears to my eyes. I just wish, you are the voice of reason and compassion out there. I really do love you. I really do respect you. I really hope people support you in every way. And if you're looking for someone who can speak truth with love, Shane's the guy. Please get in touch with him and follow him. Follow up on this and share this interview with people. I really hope that we can figure out ways to put this in front of a lot of folks. So Shane, thank you so much for your time. It's a real privilege to talk to you.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you. We'll do it again soon. Yeah.
Please.